but it's not. A lot of questions are not just ethical questions, but questions on freedom of speech and dissemination of information. Our panel first will discuss the current landscape of regulation and the laws that currently exist in the books. Caitlin will tell us how Facebook moderates content right now and what was the process that made them come to these policies. And then we're going to turn it to you. We're going to walk through two scenarios that we wrote for you. Some of them are based in real life events, some of them are not. But they're definitely all hypothetical. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you printouts with the scenarios, and we're also going to have the scenarios on the screen. And we're going to read each scenario, let you discuss amongst yourself, and then just ask. There will be 4 different choices, what to do with the content, and then I'll just ask you to raise your hand. I know that's not very tech forward, but it's definitely very foolproof. And please just feel free to ask us questions after we're done with our little panel segment, and then we can move on to the scenarios. All right, so Carl, let's start with you. Do you want to tell everyone what exactly is going on right now in the content regulation world?
Yeah. Thanks. I actually put together a quick deck, so I'm going to put on my professor hat real quick to kind of run through this. So, content moderation. I was talking to a colleague of mine last night from back where I live up in Maryland, and telling him I was going to do this panel on content moderation. Oh, great. You're going to talk about the First Amendment and stuff like that. Well, that's kind of the first thing I wanted to kind of address as part of this conversation is this isn't about the First Amendment, right? So let's look at what the First Amendment actually says. Congress shall make no laws.
That's kind of the way it starts. And the reason I emphasize the word Congress is because First Amendment law, First Amendment protections, is about government regulation of free speech. What we're here to talk about today is content moderation by private entities on their own private platforms. A good example would be the IGF Wiki, right? So we've all been to visit it. While I may love to put up whatever I want, IGF at the end of the day has the power, has the right, and arguably the responsibility to kind of moderate and keep an eye on some of the content that's up there. So then you ask, okay, fine. It's not about the First Amendment, it's about free speech, right? Free speech rights. I say something on a platform, let's just pick one, Twitter. I say something on Twitter, it's my freedom of speech to say whatever I want and do whatever I want on that platform all the time. But is it? Is it freedom of speech? What if, say, tomorrow Twitter decided to stop being a platform for all content and conversation and said, you know what, we're going to be Twitter for dogs. So we're all about dog talk, dog pictures, dogs all the time. And you know, my friend Kim, who's a cat person, bless her heart, they exist. So Kim goes onto Twitter and posts a picture of her cat and how awesome her cat is, and Twitter for Dogs says, no, this is dog-only content, cats go elsewhere, and kicks it out, takes down the post, removes it. Kim says, well, that's my freedom of speech, right? This is Twitter for Dogs. I should be able to talk about cats. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's the platform's choice to decide, right? And that gets into kind of protecting the platform and protecting other users. So is takedown of content appropriate? And when is it appropriate? When should it occur? I mean, if you go with some of the easy examples, right? Death threats, threats of violence. Most of us would say easy takedowns. And we're going to be talking about all this a little bit later and going through some scenarios. But death threats, easy takedown, threats of violence, okay. Well, what if the threat of violence is an uprising against an oppressive regime? A way to coordinate civil movement that may become violent. Is it okay then? That's a question. Let's look at some other examples. Bullying. At what point is it bullying? And what if I take down content that I consider to be bullying, somebody else doesn't? Is that okay? We have a lot of countries out there that have laws on the books that regulate what can or cannot be said online. So India, for example, is very strict about statements that disparage the government or disparage the country. Likewise, Germany famously has laws that prohibit declaring the Holocaust didn't happen or advancing Nazism. Poland considered legislation that would make it a crime to suggest the government had connections to or assisted with the Holocaust. And we have lots of laws out there. Most platforms and policies out there say we will respect the laws of that country, but what happens when those laws of that country conflict with my freedom of speech? It becomes really difficult to match those two together. And of course we've had all the talk about fake news and deep fakes and all this other content out there. When does it become an opinion? When does it become fake news? Political statements. When is it a political statement? When is it just somebody expressing an opinion? I don't like unions would be a statement. Or is it advancing a political position? These are the types of content moderation challenges that are faced by platforms today. Let's take a look at a couple examples. Okay, guess who this is? We want people to use X is the subject, I had to remove them, to express themselves and share content that is important to them. You may not use products to do or share anything that violates these terms or community standards and other terms and policies that apply to your use of X that is unlawful, misleading, discriminatory, or fraudulent. So this is from Facebook's terms of service, and they actually have a hyperlink for community standards which goes into great detail what they do or do not cover, and Caitlin's going to talk about that in a minute. Let's take a look at another. Guess who? Debate, but don't attack. In a community full of opinions and preferences, people always disagree. X, once again the company, encourages active discussion and welcomes heated debate on services, but personal attacks and direct violation of these terms of service are grounds for immediate and permanent suspension of access to all or part of the service. Then they've got a little statement at the bottom basically saying, we reserve the right to remove content that we don't like, in essence, or is copyrighted. Now, this is actually the terms of service and use for the New York Times. You may say, New York Times, why would they care about content moderation? What do they do with content moderation? Well, one of the things that's become very popular with a lot of news agencies and news websites in particular is to create the comments section. Now, as a personal rule, I try to never read the comments of anything that I've done because fortunately it's about half of them hate me and half of them like me. So, but regardless, it's very damaging. But comment sections have become very popular with respect to news websites. And New York Times in particular is a very interesting one because they have the New York Times picks. And this is where you actually have a subset of editorial content where the New York Times has gone through with human beings and actually looked at and chosen which ones they like best to promote to the top as part of the New York Times picks. So New York Times is encouraging content creation, user-generated content, but at the same time is subject to content moderation because they don't want to be known as advancing the idea of fake news or contributing to really violent or disturbing debates. Let's take a look at second to last one here. When you share content to us, you will not disclose the affiliation or not share anything that contains harmful computer code references, libelous, hateful, racist, biased, threatening, or harassing. Kind of similar to what we've seen previously, similar to New York Times, similar to Facebook, kind of in tone. This is actually from Best Buy. This is from bestbuy.com, and you may ask, why does Best Buy care about content moderation? Well, they have user reviews of products and user reviews of software. And just like the New York Times, just like Facebook, just like Twitter, now bestbuy.com, a brick and mortar retail store with an online presence, is facing content moderation questions. They have to figure out, are these opinions? Are they about the product? Or are they just somebody ranting because let's say the delivery window was missed? And then last but not least, we reserve the right in our sole discretion to discontinue, change, or improve anything and suspend or deny access to the website. This is terms that everybody should be familiar with because this is from netchoice.org, and if you haven't visited it, you should. Okay, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, I'm kind of doing a real blitzkrieg here through a lot of stuff. I usually break these out into multiple classes. So anybody interested in internet privacy law, George Mason University in the summer, great program, I teach it. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act will come up in these conversations and or other conversations throughout the day. There's a panel on fake news in particular where I suspect some of this will come up. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act at a very high level says a platform is not responsible for the content posted by others. So let's use the bestbuy.com example. If I go on there and I say, this laptop that I bought is terrible, don't ever buy it, it's a piece of trash, laptop manufacturer can sue Carl Szabo if it's a libelous statement. It cannot go after bestbuy.com. One of the things that I put in bold here is kind of what's called the Good Samaritan carve-out, which is what applies here to content moderation. And it says no action may be taken against service provider that removes or restricts access to content the provider or user considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is protected by constitutional protections. And that's what we're going to be talking about a lot here today, is content moderation and figuring out where platforms, and ultimately you, the audience, consider this to actually intersect with what should or should not be left up or taken down. And so here's a screenshot, and these are incredibly lengthy. I didn't have time to count up the number of words, and this is just a caption of the content community standards that Facebook has developed. This was that hyperlink that I mentioned earlier on. And Caitlin's going to kind of talk about the community standards that they've developed, how they help address a lot of the content moderation challenges that they face.
Thank you, and thank you, Carl. That was a really great overview about all of the various platforms that face these issues, and thank you, Ash, for setting this up and inviting me. As she said, I'm Caitlin. I work on our content policy team at Facebook, and we are the team that gets to write the rules for what's allowed and not allowed on Facebook. There are a set of global standards that you can see on the screen, and we're a global team. We have offices across 3 continents right now, and our policies are global in nature and apply across the platform. We are a team that tries to hire from really diverse backgrounds because these issues are really complex. So my background is actually in women's safety issues. I worked as a rape crisis advocate and counselor for years before joining Facebook. We have former prosecutors, we have former teachers, we have former kind of business operations specialists, we have people who come from civil society, whole kind of variety of backgrounds because these issues are really complex, and because of the intermediary liability protections, we really get to make the decisions for what's appropriate on our platform for the mission of our company and for our community. So as Carl said, we have our community standards, which are super detailed, and we'll go into that a bit, but they really start with thinking about what's right for Facebook and what's right for the people on our platform. And so we start with our values. And the values behind our community standards are first and foremost safety. We believe that we have an obligation to the people on our platform to make sure that they are safe, that Facebook is not participating in making them less safe. And frankly, the mission of our platform is to help people connect, communicate, form meaningful communities. And that's just not something anyone can do unless they feel a baseline level of safety. Our second value that we really espouse with these standards is voice. So the idea that expression is good, that's why we exist, that's why many platforms on the internet exist, are to help people connect with each other, to share about things that are meaningful to themselves, to others. And so voice is out of primacy. What that means to us is that we need a really good reason to remove speech. We think that kind of connection is a default good thing, and there are definitely limits to that. But the burden is on us to explain what harm we are preventing when we remove speech. The burden is not on the person in our community to prove that their speech is worthwhile. And that's something that works well for our platform, that looks different, and all of this, this applies to everything, but looks different for other platforms. And then kind of our third guiding value is fairness. As a global platform, as a very diverse platform, we want our policies, and we need our policies, to apply fairly and equitably across the world and for such a diverse community, and not to have disparate impacts to the extent that we can control it on different people. So if there's a policy idea that works really well in North America but doesn't scale globally, that's not something that we can implement fairly.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what is the daily routine of a team that is basically responsible for censoring or allowing content to go up and down? So what do you guys do? Is it like group work? Do you get together and battle it out?
Yes, so that's a great question. When it comes to policy development work, we're constantly looking at our policies and evaluating whether they're in the right place. We're getting feedback, so my team writes the policies, and then there's an organization that we call Community Operations that works on enforcing the policies, especially in response to what people report to us. So we get feedback from them about what they're seeing in their areas all over the world. We look at trends in the real world. We look at changes to our product that kind of maybe change the risk assessment for different things. And then we do a lot of talking, a lot of meetings with people internally. We are part of our public policy organization. We have colleagues that sit all over the world and can give us a global perspective on whatever the issue is. We go talk to experts internally and externally. So if the issue is suicide and self-injury, we will talk to our teams that deal with that content. We will go talk to third parties from all over the world. We'll talk to suicide hotlines. We'll talk to academics who specialize in this. And we'll get their input on what it is that we're balancing. We're almost always balancing kind of different competing interests, or there's a tension where that we're trying to solve for with all of our policy issues. And then we'll do lots of iteration and testing to the extent we can, trying to figure out what it is that impact on content might be before the policy goes live. And kind of in the
test groups?
Sorry,
You have test groups where you pick a region or a
no, we don't do that with our policies. We will kind of use a dark mode, see what might happen without the actions going live. That goes back to fairness and equity. We don't want to be arbitrarily assigning a different policy to you at this table than to everyone else in the rest of the room, which is an interesting thing though, because that's how most products do testing. But for policy, it doesn't really make sense. But so lots of iteration, and nothing's ever done. We have a kind of complete feedback process, and that's part of why we've really worked on increasing our transparency recently. So the detailed standards that Carl has up were released in April, and they are really the moderation guidelines our reviewers get. And you can see if you go, it's facebook.com/community standards. We have a nice intro letter, and then we have a dozen plus sections that you can open and kind of keep expanding, and you can see how detailed things get. And that is a lot for reasons of scale, and a lot, again, for reasons of equity and fairness. So it may seem obvious to say we don't allow nudity on a platform, but what do you actually mean by nudity? How much of a person's body do you have to see? What if the context is in a medical context? What if it is about breastfeeding? What if it's a child? Are you more restrictive on child nudity or less restrictive on a photo of a baby in a bathtub? So we answer all of those questions in our community standards, and we have to give that level of granularity to the teams that review content. Because what they're doing, so everything on Facebook is reportable, and we do most of our content moderation through community reports. When someone lets us know that they think something violates our standards, that goes, that's triaged often by a machine. We do use some machine learning. Machines are really good at identifying super obvious things, like well-known subsets of content. So child exploitation imagery is a great example. There is, thank goodness, a relatively small world of that content. It is very obvious when you see it. Machines can learn how to see it, can match it, can prevent it from ever being uploaded. And we don't have to have people look at it over and over again, which is great for resiliency as well. And machines can help triage some issues. You know, this is likely a suicidal post. We want to put it in front of someone first. But for the most part, content is really complex, our policies are fairly complex, and we want humans who can take all of that context into account. So something will go to a person, but they're not making a judgment call as to whether they like the post or not, whether they agree with the politics, whether they think the picture is pretty. They are applying our very detailed policies and saying, does it meet this threshold? Does it meet this definition? If it does, then I'll remove it. If it doesn't, then I'll ignore it. It takes one report on any piece of content to get it in front of someone at Facebook. And 1,000 reports doesn't change our mind. We will actually stop reviewing the same thing over and over and over again if it hasn't changed, because that's
How
not
big is
a
the
great use
team?
of time.
How big is the team of reviewers?
So that's a great question. We really view it as a whole kind of team that works on safety and security issues, because we have our reviewers, the engineers that support them, and everyone. And we're currently about 15,000 people with a commitment to be at 20,000 by the end of the year, kind of total global coverage for this. I think our review team is closer to around 7,000 people right now.
So I guess if anyone is interested, you should.
We're hiring.
They're hiring. Talk to Caitlin after this.
What's the workflow? So one of your content moderators flags something. How does it proceed?
So it's a person in the community on Facebook flags a piece of content. It's triaged by any machines to make sure that it's not, you know, the obvious things, child exploitation imagery, known Al-Qaeda propaganda, stuff like that. And then it will go to our review team for review. And our reviewers sit all over the world. We cover over 50 languages, and we hire people who are linguistically and culturally native to the areas of the world that they're supporting. So just being proficient in Spanish from your AP Spanish class is not sufficient to cover the Mexican market, nor is being from Mexico and proficient and sufficient and linguistically native to Mexico sufficient to cover the Spanish market, because there are different cultural references, different slang, different things you need to know. And we all know how nuanced language is, and being able to have people evaluate the content who are from the places that the content is coming from is really important to us. There's also a team that gets lots of training. Again, if you go through, our policies are really kind of in-depth and detailed. So lots of training and extensive retraining as well, as our policies change, as our policies update. And then we also have a really rigorous audit process to make sure that people are enforcing our policies accurately, and that we can address any gaps either in their training or frankly in our policies. Sometimes if a policy is not being enforced accurately, it's because my team wasn't clear enough in outlining what the requirements were for it. And it's a really iterative kind of process between the two teams. And then a third team that we work really closely with, we call our community integrity team. And they're the team of engineers, data scientists, technical folks who are trying to make this all easier and more scalable. We talk a lot about helping machines and computers do what they're good at so that we can help people do what they're good at. And it's not an either or, which I think you hear a lot about sometimes. The machines are going to replace people, and eventually AI will run everything, and there must be some bot somewhere on Facebook looking for nipples or something, and it's really not. the technology is not that advanced yet, as people think. We don't quite live in a sci-fi world yet. But it's also not that easy. It's really complicated in many of these cases, but what machines can do is, like I said, help us triage, help us get the right things to the right people, help us know what language something was in, help us know what issue so we can send it to a specialist. But they can't, at least not yet, and probably not ever 100% do this work because it's so contextual, as you'll see with the examples.
So I have a question. After Facebook acquires Instagram, did the content moderation synchronize? Did the teams that do that synchronize, or are they separate since they do have different guidelines and different content that goes up?
That's a really great question. There are some differences in our policies between Facebook and Instagram. Like, for instance, Facebook requires that you use your authentic identity, that people know who you are, and that it kind of matches what you go by in real life. Instagram obviously does not, and like you said, they're much more photo heavy, much more video heavy. But by and large, the standards are the same because we have the same principles at both platforms. We're trying to protect from the same harms. And so there's a large overlap in the kind of workforces for the operations, partly to minimize duplication and to use the learnings that Facebook had for nearly a decade prior to Instagram.
All right, so before we move on to the scenarios and the fun part of you guys being in the role of the moderators, are there any questions for panelists?
Okay, in back do we have a microphone?
Oh, you took the mic, not that.
Oh, sorry, I appropriated the microphone.
Didn't even give me a mic.
Hey, it's limited resources.
Thank you so much.
Okay, there we go. And we'll just use this one.
My name is Michael Masedig. I'm a journalist. I don't know how many other journalists there are in this room. But it seems like one of the reasons we're in what is a bit of a swamp is because we have three anodyne words: content, moderation, and platform. Whereas, and this was perpetuated initially by Zuckerberg and Facebook, that, oh, we're just a platform. Isn't the reality that we're dealing with, it's not a platform, you're publishing. And if you're publishing, you have a responsibility to edit. The New York Times has a couple hundred editors. You're now learning that you've got to edit. You've got 20,000 editors because you have a lot bigger audience. So haven't we sort of missed the point here, or is the point that it's time for these so-called neutral platforms to deal with the reality that they're publishing companies and they have to deal with the consequences of that? So,
it's an interesting analogy, New York Times, right? Because as the one who invoked them, the New York Times has an editorial board, right? So they've got news articles and then they've got the editorial section, but they also have the classified section, right? And usually the terms around the classified section are interactions that happen around the classified operates much more like a bulletin board. We don't assume editorial control over the content of the classified section. We may choose to deny or remove classified ads that we find objectionable, but we're not going to assume full responsibility for every transaction that occurs through the classified section. If somebody sells a lemon of a car through the classified section, should the New York Times assume that liability? Probably not. So platforms, and when we use New York Times, let's use the whole newspaper, not just the content that gets written by the editorial board. Now let's move to the idea of a platform, right? So online platforms are, and this is channeling the creators of Section 230, much more like a library, which houses content, but shouldn't be liable for the content in those books. But the library may decide that there is some content that it doesn't want in that library, right? We may not want pornography in the library, so we take that out. We leave it aside. But just because a library is assuming moderators' control over
some of the content that's within the library, doesn't mean we're going to imbue the library with all the liability and responsibility of reading every single page in every single book it houses. So I think trying to suggest that platforms, just because they moderate and remove content, because it's objectionable, because it violates their clearly defined terms of service, because it violates community standards, or they just want to create a safe space, doesn't immediately transform them into a newspaper, which is designed around the idea of articles written by the people who work for the newspaper, editorial content written by the editorial board who are employees of the newspaper. So it's not the right analogy to use to say platforms are newspapers. So I will disagree with the supposition.
And I'm going to take off the moderator hat, and I do work for an NGO that has been heavily involved with all the legislation that try to regulate platforms, and we're heavily involved with protecting free speech online. I think what we sometimes forget about the digital age is how much power it gave back to the population, and how powerful platforms, but not really platforms, but their users are when they use the platform and their voice reaches others. As Carl said, a platform can decide to only post dog content, and I fully support that, by the way. And nothing is neutral about that. Platforms are still private companies who have a business model. The social obligations that they put on themselves is their own choice. And our choice is to either be members of those platforms or delete our accounts. For example, I've never been a member of the Pinterest community. I hear it's really fun, and there's a lot of user-generated content, but it's just not my cup of tea. Honestly, for me, the interface and the content that goes up is not as interesting, hence I don't spend my time on it. There's another question. And unfortunately, this has to be the last one, so we go to the fun part of deciding on the scenarios, and then I'll let you go early for the lunch.
To your point, Ash, isn't that less the case when you have a very small number of platforms with a virtual monopoly on social networks?
I can't hear you.
Sorry. So we have a very small number of platforms with a virtual monopoly on public discourse.
Remember MySpace?
I don't know if it's quite the same. I mean, doesn't being a monopoly come with more responsibility or more liability?
I think it's for the government to decide if the platform is a monopoly or not, and if they're not, or if they have the majority of the market at the moment. They definitely have more pressure on them, but if you remember recently, after certain events, a lot of users have left big platforms. They stopped using them. It's their own choice. I know a lot of people who actually don't have social media. They're not on Twitter, they're not on Facebook. It's really hard to stop them, and know what's going on with them. They're not on LinkedIn. Sometimes when I interview, before we interview for interns or for fellows, I'm trying to find out some information about these people, and there are some people who don't use social media platforms, and it's their own choice.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of channel my time at the Federal Trade Commission and my background in economics. So let's start by breaking down the word monopoly. Of course, what's the prefix? Mono, meaning one. So we have to ask, is there only one market player? And if not, then monopoly is not the right word. The first step in identifying monopoly is what is the market we're looking at. That's the first step. You have to define the market. This came up quite prolifically when XM and Sirius were trying to merge, right? Some people were saying that the market should be defined as satellite radio only, in which case you have two people merging into one, and therefore you've got some problems. Others were saying, oh no, the market should be defined as all terrestrial radio, so you have multiple players. Others saying it should go even broader, saying it should include iPods, because iPods were new at the time, CD players, cassette decks, which also are gone. So let's look at what we're considering the market for social networks. Are we saying it's only Facebook? In which case, yeah, maybe that is monopoly. If the market is only Facebook, then yeah, that's a valid argument. If we're saying it should be broader, the ability to communicate between people, social networks, should it be then, okay, we've got LinkedIn, we've got Twitter, we've Snapchat, Facebook.
The comment section on every blog.
Yeah, so suddenly the marketplace gets much, much, much bigger.
And then the term monopoly starts to go away. Now, the counterpoint would then be, okay, we'll lock it. I spent so much time on this platform, I've got a history of this platform, that I'm trapped. I can't escape. I'm locked into my 30-year fixed mortgage type thing. Well, then we're getting into a totally different conversation about data portability, the ability to download your data. A lot of the big platforms allow you to do that. So we need to take a step back before we start throwing out words like monopoly. We need to ask, what is the market? What are we trying to achieve? Now, getting back to content moderation, so as somebody who tries to pitch op-eds all the time, and then Rob, our comm director over there, is trying to get me in some right now. If one platform says no, I go to another. If they say no, then I go to another. And eventually, I can just put it up on Medium or my own webpage. So the idea that just because there's content moderation, stifling free speech, there are so many venues out there to give speech that I don't think we should be scared when one platform decides what is right for their users.
All right, so now we're going to go to scenarios. Our wonderful volunteer Albert is going to help us click through them. The first scenario, you have printouts in front of you. Please look at that. I'm going to read the facts. You can read the platform policy. And you are the moderator. You're the team at a hypothetical company. Each time it's going to be a different company with different rules. Heads up, some of these scenarios are very intense. They're based on real life events, very controversial. So be aware of that. So yes, first scenario is a Black Lives Matter activist has posted a screenshot of an email she received from an unidentified email address. The email included violent threats to the activist's life and health and included a racial slur. The post was flagged by one of her friends. Now, please read the platform policy, discuss amongst you, and then I'm going to come back and ask you to raise your hand based on your decision to what to do with the content. You're going to be great at a band.
I'm great at my paper.
Discussion amongst yourselves is encouraged. All right. Please raise your hand if you would leave the content up. Okay, it's about 11 people. Raise your hand if you would flag the content and put a warning label on it. 7 people. Raise your hand if you want to escalate the issue with the content and put it up further up the chain in the company. All right. Raise your hand if you would take the content down. It's okay. So, Carl, what do you think about this scenario?
So, I mean, the first thing we need to do is, and this is definitely the challenge that Caitlin and her team faces and a lot of content moderators faces, you got to take off the personal hat, right? This is horrible speech. This is terrible things to say to a human being, regardless of political ideology, just writ large. So then we need to turn to what is the policy principles that we are advancing. And the policy principles talk about the threats of violence. right? That violates our community standards. So the question is not, is this free speech? The question isn't, is this First Amendment? We established that that's not an issue here. The question is, does this violate our community standards? And is this a threat of violence? Facially it is. I would say the content goes. You take it down and you say, this is a violation of our community standards.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the really interesting thing with these scenarios is there's always a valid argument on all sides, and it depends on the rules. When we look at speech, especially hate speech, we will remove hate speech used to attack someone, but we want to allow for the discussion of hate speech. So if you're discussing something that happened to you, I walked down the street yesterday and someone called me insert slur word here, that's allowed. If you want to discuss, does insert slur word here have too much power in our society? Should it be used more openly? That's valid. The tricky thing is knowing that context and whether that context is clear enough in the content. Do you always say, this is what happened to me, I want to share it, or do you sometimes just share the screenshot and assume all of your friends will know this is something that happened to you, and what your friends might know, our moderators may not know if it's not explicit context. In threats of violence is an interesting case, and I think that's a harder one to talk about what you should be allowed to reshare, even if it's to condemn or discuss, because it could still be very specific. It could still provide instructions for a specific method. There are some types of speech that are still dangerous and harmful no matter the context that they're shared in, and some types of threats of violence can fit squarely in that. So it's a really interesting one.
So, I mean, this gets back to the point that you were mentioning earlier about just having the computer do it all, right? So, racial slur gets taken down, period. Well, maybe not match with what your end goal is, which is to have a fruitful discussion of, is this appropriate speech? Let's talk about this as a society type content. And then the same thing could be true about, how do you deal with the collision between newsworthiness and just kind of offensive content? It's kind of the same question, but it's a different.
Yeah, I think on your first point first, that's totally right. Computers are really good at identifying slur words. They are really bad at knowing the context in which they were shared. And that's what we need people for. On the newsworthy one, that's honestly one of the hardest issues we face is how to balance reporting on something that is validly part of the political discussion with not allowing certain things. And we frankly have, unsurprisingly, the kind of very detailed standards on this when there are some things that are never newsworthy. We don't allow videos of beheadings on our platform, no matter whether it's the BBC reporting on what happened to a journalist that was kidnapped, or whether it was someone praising it and saying, yay, go beheadings. Either way, not allowed on our platform. But there are other things, photos of a genocide that include bodies stacked up and those bodies happen to be naked. That is maybe a really good newsworthy reason to allow nude content, even though nude content generally violates our policies because it is raising awareness of and representing a historical atrocity.
Didn't mean to steal your scenario.
That's all right. No, before we move on, as a retired law professor, I lasted on the 2 years. The end of the platform policy gives the team that exception where if they think that the spirit of the policy instead of the letter is more important, they can leave the content up. So all of you were right in your own way. All of this could have happened at a platform with this policy that was applied to it. All right, scenario number 2. A photograph from World War II depicting the horrors of the concentration camp in Nazi Germany has been posted. A mountain of dead naked bodies is on the photograph. The platform policy, our platform removes violent or disturbing images as part of its community standards. Please discuss. This is a shorter scenario and shorter policy. So let's vote. Raise your hand if you would leave the content up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13. Raise your hand if you would flag the content and put a warning label on it. 4 people. Escalate? Anyone escalating? Okay. Take down the content? All right, I'm just going to address this. Unfortunately, the platform policy just says disturbing images are bad, and just based on just this policy, a platform would probably take down the photograph. Now, it's your personal choice if you would stay on the platform afterwards. Let's move on to scenario number 3. Internet personalities Sapphire and Lennon, who have made themselves locally known as political commentators, shared a series of posts arguing that teenage survivors of a school shooting are crisis actors who are financially backed by a powerful foundation that funds anti-Second Amendment projects. Please read the policy and discuss if you would take these posts down. Does anyone follow Sapphire and Lennon? All right, guys. Raise your hand if you would leave Sapphire and Lennon's posts up. All right. Raise your hand if you would flag their content. Raise your hand if you would escalate their posts. Raise your hand if you would take it down. I'm gonna throw in a little audience participation. People who would flag the content, or people who would take it down. Anyone wants to comment on your decision making, why you would take such action? Carl, do you want
Isn't
to?
it potentially libelous?
Microphone, no? 1 second, we're gonna get to your microphone. This is also live streamed, so I just want our audience online to hear everything we say, and also please participate in the discussion using the hashtag IGFUSA and hashtag IGFUSA platforms. Go
Where do
ahead.
libel laws come into play here?
Professor?
Thanks. So, the example I like to use, libel laws. So if I am posting something on a platform, and this is where Section 230, the law that I cited earlier, comes into play. So if I post on a platform that Rob dresses terribly, which if you look at him, you can see is not the truth, Rob can sue Carl Szabo for libel, defamation of character, stuff like that, but he cannot bring an action against the platform. It's a neutral platform. So to the extent that libel comes into play here, the privacy policy that we see here does not address legality. A lot of privacy policies say that we will comply with laws. So that would be a way to remove the content. But on the face of it, it says the content is determined to be unsafe to the community. It shall be removed and show respect for others. It depends. I mean, this is a tough one because the policy I don't think is narrowly written enough to give you the type of guidance that I would want as part of a content moderator to take a look at it. Because I could say, well, we're not impugning and we're other users of the platform. We're impugning people off platform. It's newsworthy, it's worth discussion. We're not doing it to be offensive. We think that this is a truthful statement. I don't know. I would go with the cop-out answer of escalate the issue and let somebody else figure it out.
Caitlin?
I was going to say, this is partly why our reviewer guidelines are far more detailed than these hypothetical ones, is because we do need to give reviewers guidance on what to do in every situation. As Carl explained, the platforms don't consider libel laws or don't map one-to-one with them. They're also very different globally. But we do have our policies against harassment and bullying. And for Facebook, at least, not the hypothetical kind of platform here, but we do have policies. We would count likely, it's hard to say without seeing the exact piece of content, but accusations that a victim or survivor of a violent tragedy is a crisis actor, lied, paid to mislead, etc., violates our harassment policies.
I think it's also important to be aware that, for example, Facebook has a huge team and they spend a lot of days and nights writing these guidelines and working on them and improving them based on current events. Where you're a smaller platform that has a comment section or just are a startup, you don't have lawyers. You maybe have someone out of law school who decided to join a startup and live a life for a little bit. So this policy guidelines can be all they have, a very vague, honestly, if you're right out of law school, you'd rather have something vague and then cop out than have a detailed policy that you have to be responsible for. All right, moving on to scenario number 4. I'm gonna read it out. Alvaro is running back. Thank you so much to every volunteer at the IGF USA, by the way. They're doing an amazing job. They were here way earlier than we were. A person regularly posts in a group forum that the Armenian genocide never happened. This person supplements statements with photographs, letters, and other documents that the poster believes are real but are in fact fakes. Platform's policy is we allow open dialogue and conversations even if contradictory. However, we do not allow posting of false statements that are posted as facts. Please discuss. All right. So, full disclosure, I'm ethnically Armenian. So this was, yeah, what a shocker based on my last name. So what would you guys do? What would the audience do? Would you leave a content up? Raise your hand. All right. Would you flag the content? One person? Escalate the issue? Would you take the content down? All right, I would say that, for example, if this content was just the statements about the Armenian genocide not happening, the content would have stayed up based on these policies. However, the fact that there are false statements and false materials that are attached to the post make it eligible for removal. There are countries, by the way, Robert? Yes.
So, yeah, I think you were maybe just about to say there are countries out there that refuse to accept the fact that the Armenian genocide happened. And, you talk about that, if you hire moderators that are sensitive to local, to like their local culture and language and all these sorts of things, if you exist in one of these countries, let's say this is Facebook's policy, I don't think it is, but let's say it is, and you are hiring someone in Turkey and this is someone in Turkey posting this, that becomes, a very difficult game of what is the truth when internationally the truth is disputed.
And I was going to also elaborate that, for example, in countries like France and Germany, denying Armenian genocide is a crime. I think in France it also involves jail time. So Caitlin, as someone who deals with, conflict of laws and historical interpretation, what would a platform do?
Yeah, so this is, again, different platforms can take different stances on this. And I know there's a panel later on misinformation, which is a little bit later, so I don't want to kind of scoop that one. Facebook's stance is generally not to police the truth, which sounds a little bit like a cop-out, but I think one of the reasons is the reason that Robert brought up, that a lot of these things are internationally disputed and very validly disputed. We have the UN, we have other international bodies that declare whether or not something is considered a genocide. Each country has different standards for considering whether something is a genocide. And to have a private company make that determination instead of these internationally recognized bodies seems probably not the ideal outcome. And then there's also kind of disputes or disputed disputed kind of ideas or determinations at different levels. So there's just things that Facebook can't know. What happened at the town council meeting in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania last Tuesday and who said what is definitely something that someone could be misrepresenting on Facebook, but it's not something we'd ever be able to know and enforce. So I think you have both the issue of actual acquisition of knowledge at this scale that we operate on, and then you have the issue of a private company making determinations that are probably better played out in other international forums rather than being policed by a company who decides what's true and what's not true, when a lot of these things are very validly disputed.
Yeah, and looking at the platform, the fake platform policy that we put up here, I would leave the content up, right? Because what the policy lacks is a mens rea. What is the intent? What is the knowledge standard of the poster, right? So the policy says we do not allow posting of facts that are posting of false statements that are posted as facts. But what you're seeing here are posting of statements that the poster believes are truthful, that believes are facts. But the preamble to that is we want an open conversation, open dialogue. So perhaps by leaving this up, we're actually engendering an open conversation, an open dialogue about what occurred. And by having an open dialogue, you could actually change somebody's mind as opposed to just saying, we're not going to talk about it at all.
If I lived in France, I'd screenshot it and send it to the authorities, please.
So I have a question for Facebook going back to this idea of not policing facts. So, for example, the vast majority of scientists believe that the Earth is flat. There's an international consensus on that, but is round. Sorry. but there
I thought you were giving a hypothetical.
There are some avid believers that is not a fact, but according to your criteria, actually there is an international consensus that the Earth is round. So according to this platform policy, would it be removed because it is clearly a false statement?
So just to be very clear, this is not Facebook's platform policy. So according to this platform policy, I would probably remove it, but that's not our platform policy. We will not censor someone on Facebook for saying the Earth is flat. That seems like such a silly statement, but when we do look back over history, censoring people who believed something outside of the norm was actually something that hindered the progress of science when everyone thought the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun revolved around us. And Galileo, this is a little, sounds a little silly to pick something out of history, but Galileo said, nope, sun is the center, not the Earth. That obviously didn't work out very well for him, even though 99% of people at that time believed the Earth was the center and that was fact. He thought something different. I don't think the Earth is actually flat. I don't think we're going to all change our minds on that. But we don't want to be the platform that comes in and censors someone. And also, to kind of Carl's point, we don't want to punish someone for being wrong, for having a belief that they may genuinely and validly hold as true and may have been what they were taught. It doesn't kind of feel like an adequate thing to say, no, I'm going to censor you for being incorrect, even though that's what you were taught in your family or your country.
There's definitely also a value that comes with making a statement that might not be factually true, or just not, a lot of people wouldn't agree with it, and then being part of a discussion. I've changed my mind multiple times throughout my life through engaging on these platforms. Not that I believe that the earth is flat, but I don't have a lot of knowledge in the scientific field because I've been a lawyer for way too long. So sometimes you ask a question, sometimes you set up and say, you know, I've heard this on the news, or I've heard this from this person. Hey, scientists out there, if you have time, please educate me, tell me if this is right. That value that comes from engaging online, I think, is huge. So let's move on to scenario number 5. The law in country A, I'm not sure if, is this on your printouts? Do you see the scenario? Okay, awesome. The law in country A makes it illegal to criticize its leader. I'm from Russia. Social media company which operates everywhere in the world is notified of a post that criticizes the leader of country A for a statement made by the leader. The platform policies would comply with all the laws and regulations. We favor a robust conversation and freedom of speech. Please discuss. I'm going to Google it right now. My main goal is to make them realize it's way harder than they think. Like, do I think terminate genocide posts should be taken down? Do I personally think it should be taken down? Yes, but I don't think it actually should, like, by the platform, you know. Yeah, where it becomes personal. Yeah. 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 Do you have a question? After we... All right. So please raise your hand if you would leave the content up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9 people. Please raise your hand if you would flag the content or put a warning label on it. Okay. Raise your hand if you will escalate the issue up the chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. Raise your hand if you would take the content down. 4, 5. All right, we have a question. So we'll go to the question before we discuss the scenario.
Jeff Jarvis from CUNY. It's inadequate information here because you don't have the locality. That's critical to this and the worldwide discussion. So if it is in country A that this occurs, then you might use, and the policy is also incomplete here because every policy I see would have the word local laws in there. So it's really hard to say.
The internet doesn't have borders, does it, Carl?
Yeah, the question is right, and I actually, because I ended up writing this one, I specifically made it vague because I think there's a really interesting way that we can kind of look at it. The first question is, how would you respond, I'm going to just say the United States, if the poster's in the United States, then do we leave the content up? Because but the law may apply regardless of where the content, where the statement was. But it's on the internet, so it's where it was received. So if I'm the leader of country A, I'm pissed, and I'm going to say, my laws apply. I want to bring, this person posted on the internet, that post was read inside my country by my people, therefore I have jurisdiction over it. That's, so, but it's not that simple. If I'm an international company, and I have employees in that country, my employees are getting thrown in prison. So, Jeff, you're absolutely right. Theoretically, this should only apply if it's a country A resident making the statement about country A. But the way that we've seen it applied has been, okay, company, okay, platform, this was made on your platform is being viewed inside my country, I'm gonna arrest your employees, and we can then have a discussion about whether the content should remain up or down.
Caitlin?
That's the challenge.
Yeah, and then I know we have a question back there to get to too. I think these are some of the toughest issues, and I think a lot of the questions you raised are right, because we may have different gut feelings about this. If it is Germany and a Holocaust denial law, so a democratic country with a law that most people find principled, versus Thailand with a you cannot insult the king law, so an undemocratic, country with a law that we generally, at least in the US, does not resonate as principled. So Facebook as a company, first of all, we are against government censorship, especially censorship that is against internationally recognized human rights legislation. That being said, we do respect local law, in part because local law is often democratic and is the law of the countries in which we operate. And the way that this plays out in practicality is any request to remove content that may be illegal in a certain jurisdiction must be kind of very specifically tailored to that jurisdiction. The specific piece of content must cite the law, must demonstrate that this law has been enforced before, that it's a real kind of practicing law on the books. So we're pretty specific on exactly how it comes in and kind of the rules by which you have to play to get this to be recognized. And then we will push back if we think it's very against the international human rights norms. We're part of the Global Network Initiative, which brings a lot of companies together to do this work. Where we do end up complying, we do it as narrowly as possible, so both in terms of the content in question, so if it is a post, we will comply with respect to the post, but not the entire profile. We do it as narrowly as possible with respect to jurisdiction, so if the content is illegal in Turkey, it will be inaccessible in Turkey, but not in the rest of Europe or the rest of the world. And then we try to be as transparent as possible. So we will notify the person who posted that their content was restricted because of a government request, not because of a Facebook policy. And then we will publish that in our bi-yearly transparency report, so that everyone can see what governments are doing this and what the nature of their requests are. And we do look to and work with this community of folks in civil society to be a voice for where those things are appropriate and where they're not appropriate.
We had another question?
Yes. Awesome.
All right. Well, let's move on to our last scenario. It's about a diner, and then we're going to move on to lunch after that. So, a diner gives a negative rating about a meal. Do you want to do this one? You actually wrote it too.
So diner gives a negative rating about a meal under the awning of a Washington, D.C. restaurant last weekend. So if everyone just rewinds like 2 days, it was really wet outside for a really long time. And I'm still depressed about it. So that's what I was thinking when I wrote this. Anyways, so they give a negative review while they were dining outside of a restaurant last weekend. And for folks at home, it was monsoon season last week. They're complaining about the humidity, the splashing of rain from sidewalk, and passersby ducking under the awning. So they're complaining about the experience they had as a result of the humidity and splashing of rain and people trying to get out of the rain. So the platform's policy, and this is where somebody's reviewing, please make sure your contributions are relevant and appropriate to the forum. For example, reviews aren't the place for rants about a business's employment practices, political ideology, extraordinary circumstances, or other matters that don't address the core of the consumer experience. So at the end of the day, should this content be left up because of the weather? So that's the question before you, and consider and decide.
All right, guys. I know everyone is ready for lunch. I am. Raise your hand if you would leave the content up. Please, one second, I'm a lawyer, I can't count. 9. I'm sorry, it's not because I'm a lawyer, it's because that's just, that's the way my brain works. 9 people, raise your hand if you would flag the content. All right? Raise your hand if you would escalate this content up chain. Raise your hand if you would take it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, I feel like there are a few people who didn't vote. Come on. It's your civil liability. It's civil duty, sorry. All right, Carl, what would you, I honestly would leave this up, but what would you do?
You know, I look at reviews online a lot. In fact, I wrote a review for a product that died on me after a month just the other day. Those I find to be really valid reviews. If you look at 5-star reviews and 1-star reviews, sometimes the 1-star reviews are really silly. Like, I used the example of Best Buy earlier. The package didn't get there on time. Well, that doesn't tell me if this is a good TV or not. But this does feel like it's related to the experience at the restaurant. Maybe the tables were too close to the curb, and that's why I'm getting splashed, and maybe they should have moved it back. Maybe when people are ducking under the awning, maybe they should fence off the awning to prevent that. If it's impinging my dining experience, I think that's relevant to the idea of a review of the restaurant, because the restaurant's not just the food, it's the experience. And thus, I would leave the content up.
What if there was part of a restaurant that didn't have a roof? It had like those little gazebo situations. That would have been even worse.
Me outside.
I think this one is interesting, and Facebook does have a reviews product, and I think determining what is validly part of the review is really hard. And we were talking up here kind of, as everyone else was talking about, how this policy is very clear that political ideology is not relevant, but of course we all live in DC, and it's really interesting to consider whether the fact that a restaurant will or won't serve a certain person, or the fact that a cake baker will or won't bake a cake for a certain type of couple, whether that might actually be relevant to your consumer decision making, And whether a platform gets to decide, if you get to decide that it's relevant to your consumer decision making, is, I think, it's a whole another lens on content moderation that we don't talk about or explore as much, because the point of a review platform is different than a point of a kind of broad connection platform. It's there to serve a specific purpose, but there's still a lot of choices to be made in what benefits that purpose.
So hypothetically, if you were evaluating the reviews of a restaurant that some consumers who haven't gone there are mistaking for another restaurant that has the same name, would you take those down because it's a review of the wrong place?
I am not an expert in our review policies. There's kind of a different team that owns that, but I think personally, that would be more irrelevant because it is about the wrong place. So if you have a policy that says you don't allow irrelevant reviews, you don't allow a review to talk about the fact that the sky is blue, then you probably shouldn't allow a review to talk about a different business.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, if I'm a platform, I ask myself, what is the purpose of my reviews? And is it to give somebody a place to rant, whether positive or negative? Or is it to provide a service to other potential consumers, right? Is the purpose of my review section to give people actionable information as to whether they should visit this restaurant, buy this item, or stay at this hotel? If it is that, and there is an errant review that gets placed, and that's what I think my review section should do, is provide people useful information, then I'll probably try to take that down per my terms. And that's kind of why here I would leave the content up, because I think it's relevant to the user experience. And I keep going back to the example of somebody giving a 1 star because the package got there late, and that has nothing to do with the underlying product. Those are things that I would probably consider trying to get out of the system.
These days, there are also bots now that would leave reviews on Amazon and other websites that are not even real reviews that I know platforms are battling with for algorithms, and just people who have to look at them and evaluate if that looks like a real review, if that the pattern is of a real human and not a bot located somewhere in Russia. So before we close out, I just wanted to ask our wonderful panelists to give your last thoughts, just in a few sentences. What do you want our wonderful audience to take away, or what do you think is the future for platform moderation? Because there are more and more challenges to Section 230 that are coming up. Recently, this year, Congress passed a law called the SESTA-FOSTA bill, this hybrid, that amended Section 230 for the first time. So the question is this a slippery slope where we kind of chip away the immunity that platforms have, or are we going to continue having this immunity that created this vibrant space where free speech and commerce can flourish?
So content moderation is tough. It really is. I mean, the examples that we put together are just kind of, for the most part, some of the easier ones that a lot of sites and services face. Content moderation is really tough, and that's why we wanted to kind of go through this exercise, to kind of get you thinking, well, they took down that content. That's got to be a violation, and getting out of the idea of, well, it may be offensive to me, but it's not a violation of the policy. But Ash, to your point on Section 230, one of the important prongs, and that was the one that I had bolded earlier on, is the Good Samaritan provision of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So if we want to enable platforms to remove objectionable content and encourage them to keep an eye out for this objectionable content, then we need to give them permission to do so without assuming liability for all content. And that's one of the really important prongs that a lot of us sometimes forget when we're talking about treating platforms as a place where people can post and then saying the platform's not liable for those posts. If they want to monitor for the offensive content and take it down, then you can't say, well, you missed this, therefore you're liable for it. So content moderation is really hard, and we need to enable platforms to have the tools and the latitude to figure out what content is best for their users. And that's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, and just I would echo all of that, and I think something that both the conversation and the scenarios did very well was also to demonstrate the diversity of areas that content moderation affects. So I think sometimes our mental model is Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but content moderation is about the New York Times, content moderation is about any blog that any one of you might have, content moderation is about a startup, is about a restaurant review site, it's about so many other things. So I think our mental model needs to broaden when we think about it. And that every platform does it a little bit differently based on the purpose and principles of that platform, and that diversity of places in the marketplace you can go to share your content is an important thing and is part of what the liability protections protect.
Sure. Why don't we do questions before we wrap up? But really quick.
What happened to 230 in the recent legislation? What's the impact for content sites and such on 230's protections?
So the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act and the FOSTA, which I don't, sex trafficking, they now find the platforms liable if there is sex trafficking that happens on them, and they if they don't cooperate with the law enforcement. The problem is before, platforms big and small would collaborate and give information freely with law enforcement. Now, the knowledge standard that now, for example, a victim of sex trafficking or their family can sue the platform with, if a platform X, if someone uses my blog post's comment section and uses some kind of code to initiate a trafficking deal, and then if I go to law enforcement because I catch it, then someone can sue me because they say you knew, hence you're liable.
Yeah, I think it's still kind of to be determined how it ends up totally playing out, but the intent of it, and I think a lot of Ash's points on whether they made the intent kind of narrow and clear enough was to go after websites like Backpage that are kind of sole purpose and lots of people believe have met a high standard of knowledge that this was happening on their platform and chose not to address it. And but it was meant to tackle that.
As a result, Reddit and Craigslist and a bunch of other websites have shut down some parts of their website because they're afraid of having that liability on them without monitoring or having the knowledge about these awful, awful acts happening.
Thanks. I'm Andrew Bridges of Fenwick & West in San Francisco. It seems to me that what we're talking about here is the classic problem of rigid law versus flexible equity, and that you're announcing all sorts of principles and rules that you're claiming to follow. Looking earlier, I'm not sure anybody in this room could tell you whether the values, the community values of Facebook and New York Times and Best Buy differ at all, because all terms of service are litigation documents. They are meant to provide maximum flexibility and minimum obligations and liability. All terms of service, because I write them as a litigator, all terms of service say exactly the following: mumble, 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 we may do exactly what we want to do and you can't sue us. That's what they all say. So at the end of the day, and I get that it's a tough job, I worry that platforms are hurting themselves by pretending to have a great objective infrastructure for what is ultimately a subjective operation, one hopes with as diverse a set of constituencies as possible. But it's not much different, I think, from saying we have a velvet rope and we will allow what we deem cool and trust us, we're trying our best. Isn't that the most honest way of saying it?
So I'm not a lawyer and I did not write our terms of service, but I think that's one of the major reasons why our community standards are separate. They're incorporated into our terms of service. The terms of service reference them, and that is the kind of legally binding document. But we tried very hard to write our community standards in as plain English as you can make what I think when you print it out turns out to be a 45-page document to be, and that's why we tried to up-level those principles and values and we talk about the policy rationale behind each policy. So if you don't want to read the 20-page explanation of what exactly we mean by nudity, you can still understand what we're trying to cover. But you're right that like those are standards that we hold ourselves to, and we hold ourselves very strongly to the idea of applying them equitably and fairly. And frankly, the press, public, and civil society also hold our feet to that, even if they may or may not be able to sue us over it. We are heavily scrutinized for it, and we believe it's the right thing to do, but they are very intentionally separate from our terms of service, not written by lawyers, and written as the document that we apply to our own content.
And, you know, I've written a number of op-eds on this. These are private platforms. As much as people think that they are the most, that they're a fundamental right or anything like that, these are private places at the end of the day. So if I came in here and I wore something wholly inappropriate, you know, IGF is bad, you know, Shane Twos could turn me back at the door, right? It's a private space.
Even if they just didn't like green and you wore green, they could turn you back at the door.
So, you know, it's a private space first. Second, look, back in my old days, I used to write terms of service, I used to write privacy policies. People complain, nobody reads them. Well, guess what? They're not for you. They're for other lawyers to read when platforms get sued and say, well, here, we laid it out. Now, what I was really impressed by, and I really do recommend this, check out Facebook's community standards, because they actually make it pretty easy to figure out what's going on. Now, it goes multiple layers deep, but there's a table of contents on the left. You can always up-level, and it subdivides. And it was really impressive how they break it down.
And as of 2 days ago, it's searchable now.
Excellent, yeah. So I was really impressed for that, because it's different from the term service. It's different from the privacy policies, because it's actually written for an audience like, well, I'm a lawyer, but for my wife. So I think that's something to take notice of. Term of service privacy policy are not for you. Facebook's got the infrastructure and the size, and they stepped up and did this. So I think at the end of the day, there's something to be done there.
When writing the scenarios and putting together this panel, I had to push myself and to put in things that make my blood boil and ideas that I don't agree with. And that was the purpose of this panel. We wanted to ask more questions than give you answers, and to maybe encourage you to read more about this or to become more comfortable living in the gray area, not knowing the right answer right away. We are happy to continue the discussion after the panel is over. I am going to let you go a minute before the end. Thank you so much for participating, and join me in thanking our speakers.